JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Tonight's guest, Eleanor Reissa, is a Tony Award-nominated director, a prize-winning playwright, former artistic director of the Folkbean Yiddish Theater, host of the Yale University Forchnorf Video Archive podcast, Those Who Were There, Voices from the Holocaust, and currently shares the audio guide duties at the Museum of Jewish Heritage's latest exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do. Eleanor has sung in every major venue in New York City and in festivals around the world. She is a storyteller in English and Yiddish and is often the voice for the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, including their new episodic radiocast, Who is Guilty? She is also the author of The Letters Project, A Daughter's Journey, which she and Rabbi Bronstein will be discussing tonight. The Letters Project has been described as a moving memoir that reads like a mystery, and although it's heartbreaking, it also includes Eleanor's beloved voice, which is hilarious and full of life. David Maralik, author of The Promise and the Dream, writes, among the greatest number of personal takes on the Holocaust, Eleanor's book really stands out, both for its intelligence and its courage. In this brutal, poignant, and searingly honest book, Eleanor manages to somehow find insight and purpose in the ashes. Please welcome Eleanor Reissa.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Pleasure.
Mine.
We're so thrilled that you're going to begin tonight by doing a short reading, by giving us a taste of the book in your own voice. So why don't you just set that up? Tell us what you're going to be reading.
I'm going to cut to the end. It's not really a surprise. I'm not ruining it for those of you that haven't read it. But this is what I call the takeaway from a number, from this journey that I took. So, it's been more than 2 years since I was in Germany. Before I went there, I knew nothing. Now, I know a little bit more than nothing, but still not everything. The darkness that has been with me all of my days is clearer now, more defined, based on facts, rather than shapeless shadows. The sources of my sorrow are labeled and filed and have a beginning, although not an end. That will die when I die. There is also a reawakened paranoia. My senses are more alert to nationalism and bigotry. The sound of marching boots and the smoke in the distance make me wonder about packing my bags and where and when to flee if the bastards get too close again. What means too close? I'm witnessing history mutate and repeat. So soon, here are my takeaways. I am certain, even though I'm not a scientist and even though I have done little research, that my own rage, of which there is plenty, and my existential fear and consciousness of death, and my sarcasm and greed and empathy, all of these things and more come directly from the womb in which I was born. My genes contain the chromosomes of memory, their memory, my parents' memory, inherited trauma, My chromosomes remember the years of starvation, the years of freezing, the years of beatings, the constant flinching, waiting for the next blow, preparing for the pain, the trauma of being whipped on the block, the hiding and the smoking and the clipping of hair and sleeping on the wooden shoes, and the being secretive and being wily and being scared to death and scared of death. My radar is locked on to the stink of anti-Semitism and racism, as well as the cruel arbitrariness of extermination. A simple turn to the right or left can hasten the end or can equal the end. How can you ever be careful enough? That's one part of this takeaway, the part about me, about how and who I am and why. Is my anger and irreverence a bit more understood now? Forgiven? I hope so. There's something else, though, something I've been holding inside for these 2 years, waiting for this moment to say, here and now. I will repeat these words again and again until the very end of my days. My father and the others who lived and died during that time, in that place, were not survivors. No, I reject that term. Those people did not survive. Dogs survive. Cows survive. What those people did, all of them, not just the ones in the ghettos or the forests or the basements or the camps, was fight. They were fighters. Whether they lived or were killed, they fought. With every molecule of their breath and brain and brawn, they fought to live. With all their might and their heart and prayers and selflessness and selfishness and guns and books and pens and bread, they were Holocaust fighters, not survivors. In the cattle cars, up the chimneys, in the attics, tunnels, sewers, they fought for their lives, for our lives, for my life. I am not the child of Holocaust survivors, no. I reject that passive, minimizing, head-bowing term. My father never bowed down his head, he said. Well, why should I? Why should we? Words count. I, Eleanor Reissa Schlisselberg, am the daughter of Holocaust fighters, courageous humans who fought the devil like hell for life to the death. Can you imagine if the world had called them Holocaust fighters? To have been the daughter of fighters? Rather than the daughter of survivors, I would have been Supergirl, for goodness sake, strong and proud, rather than an ashamed, hidden light. What is the daughter of a survivor entitled to? Nothing. Not a thing. Whatever I had was more than I needed and way more than they had. It was all gravy. My life was gravy, and that was enough. But the daughter of a fighter, what is the daughter of a fighter entitled to? Everything. Every damn thing. They fought for a full, rich, worthy life, and anything less is to spit into their sweet, loving faces. That is my inheritance.
Question. Now that you've set it up so beautifully,
yes.
By the end of the book, the title of the book is The Letters Project. So why don't you just explain what the letters are and how the journey first began?
When my mother died in 1986, in her lingerie drawer, I found in a plastic baggie 56 letters, all written in 1949, written to her. It was written in Latin letters, but I could make out the first sentence only. Tayere ruchale in shamale, which means, I thought was Yiddish, and means dear ruchale, diminutive form of Ruchel, or Rachela, and Shamale, her son. I couldn't make out another word in the letters, and the letters were stationery, business stationery from my father, and the writing was all over the page. I mean, it was large paper, and on every inch of every corner, on both sides of every of those 56 pages was writing. I could only read also the last line of these letters, which said either kisses in Yiddish or something, and Chaskel Schlisselberg, my father's name, his full name, every letter, Chaskel Schlisselberg. He died in 1976, 10 years earlier. They divorced in 1964, 5, something like that. I only saw my father on Sundays for most of my life, and he was 50 when I was born. He was 75 or 6 when he died. So I missed the first 2/3. By the time I met him, he was in America, and the letters are all from Stuttgart. And that was where my father was living after he lived through the Death March and Auschwitz. He went to Stuttgart, which he considered home. He had moved there after World War I. My father was born in 1901. My mother was born in 1922. And she went to Uzbekistan, lived through the war years in Uzbekistan, and he managed to stay out of Auschwitz until 43. And I didn't know that. I knew he was in Auschwitz. I knew when he was born. I didn't know much about him. So everybody's dead. I have these letters, and I show them to friends, and nobody, I have, große Jiddische dicke Freund, big Yiddishy, Jewy friends, and nobody can make out what these letters say. In 2017, I got a job in a show called Indecent on Broadway, and the writer, Paula Vogel, and the director, Rebecca Teichman, had been working on this project for more than 10 years. And they hired me to be a part of the project. And I made a little extra money on Broadway. And I thought, well, if these two people think I'm of worth, and they spent so much time following a project they thought was worthy, maybe it's time for me to try to have these letters translated. So that is kind of that was my idea. Not an easy idea, I will tell you. It's hard. The reason I didn't do it in part was because it's not easy to translate 56 letters. And that is what the book seems to be about. Not really, as it turns out, but that is what the impetus that moved me to begin to open the door to the past.
And that brought you to Europe, basically.
And that brought me to Europe. So the main translator of this book was a woman named Yeva, who was the girlfriend of a Yiddish artist who lives in Berlin. And if it weren't for Yeva, we probably would not be sitting here. So I hired her as the primary translator, and this one year, the beginning, I was going to Berlin to sing with Frank London, who is a musical partner that I have, one of my musical partners, and we met with Yeva. I met with Yeva. I had to give her money. She had to give me translations that she had done. And she says to me over coffee in November of 2018, she says, my brother lives in Stuttgart. I said, that's nice. She said, yeah, and I'm going there in January. I said, good for you. And she said, he lives right around the corner from the address on your father's letters. And if you want to go with me, I'll go a little early and stay a little late, and we'll go to Stuttgart and to Ulm a city nearby, which is where my mother was in a displaced persons camp, and where my mother and father, who were dating or whatever, wooed in Ulm. And she said, if you want to go. And I thought, go. Why should I go? Go? I mean, everybody is dead. The war is 50 years ago. What will I find? What's there? And I went. I went. There were a number of other circumstances that a friend of mine who is a writer and lives in Israel, an expat, had this hotel that he wanted to turn into a writing retreat. And when I was trying to figure out if I should go to Germany, he calls me and he says, hey, are you working on anything? Because I'm turning over the hotel to a couple of writers for a couple of weeks. So if you're interested. And I said, well, when is that? And it turned out to be like 2 days after my trip to Germany would have been. So that's what I did. I pulled on the thread, and a great many people, many of them German, helped me uncover the past in a way that I didn't think possible, and a little bit like, in a way, like what Einstein, or my perception of what Einstein may have said, which is that time exists on another plane. And if you go down the river of time, and if you want to go to the past, you get out of your little boat and you walk upstream, and you can find the past. And I found the past, and ultimately the present and the future.
It was so interesting to me when you were concluding the book, just before the section that you read, you wrote about how the letters turned out to be a MacGuffin, right? MacGuffin is like an Alfred Hitchcock term for something which drives a plot, or I guess precipitates a plot, but actually the story is about something else, right? It's the excuse for a movie as opposed to like the main part of the movie.
Correct.
Like The Ring and Lord of the Rings, or that kind of thing.
Yes.
Right? So I guess maybe briefly you could explain, if the letters turned out just to be a MacGuffin, what was the story really about? What did you find there?
So I'm kind of an instinctual artist. I'm not a big researcher. I operate kind of by the seat of my pants and by what I see and smell, and I use like my senses instead of the library, pluses and minuses in that. And so I went to Germany with nothing of I didn't do any research. I thought we'd go to I have many photographs, black and white photographs, where my family lived and where they wooed. And I thought, okay, I'd like to find the place where the pictures were taken. And that was and go to the address where my father lived. But people, Frank London's manager, this fellow Lutz, heard about this project, and he said, I know people in Stuttgart, I know people in Ludwigsburg, I'll connect you with them. And he connected me with them before I left. And via email, this person, Hans-Dieter Huber, sends me an email and says, give me your parents' date of birth and place. And then the next thing I know, I get an email back from him that says, I've discovered testimony that your father gave in 1947, which is 2 years before any of these letters were written. And then he says, I've discovered testimony that your father gave at a different place. And like people, and Yeva contacted the Ulm archives and found information about my mother. And it was like, so it turned out that I found information about who my father primarily, but my mother as well, and a bit of extended family, who they were from 1901 until 1967. He died in 76, but there's testimony also because he applied for Wiedergutmachung, for reparations. And when you apply for reparations, Germany keeps all the documents that you need to prove to them what they did to you. You need to prove to them how much you wore the star, the yellow star, how much you lost in the business, how many people were killed in your family, so go try to prove that, but that's a different issue. So the book, so I, like you, I start at page 1 of the journey. I'm going, I don't know what I'm gonna find, and we go together, and I'm expecting nothing, and I find everything. And my whole life, I would say to you that it's not like I didn't know my father was in Auschwitz. It's not like I didn't know he must have taken the cattle car. But I didn't know. In the transcript, in his own words, I find what those days and nights in the cattle car were like. I've read Primo Levi, I've read other accounts, but when it's your father, when your father says, this is what I saw, this is what I witnessed, this is how it felt, this is who hit me, this is how all of these things, I looked at those pictures my whole life of the men sleeping or resting or being held in those in the concentration camp on what looks like shelves. They're in the striped pajamas and their cheeks are sunken and their eyes are hollow and they're peering. They're all kind of stacked up living and peering at whoever is taking those particular photos. And always in these photos, I look for my father. In every ghetto, people are like this. I think, which is him? Is he here? Have I found him? And never found him, of course. And at a certain point, I stopped looking for him. Well, I found him. I found him, and he says, I was on the 3rd level. He says, I was on the 3rd level. He didn't, that's what he says. So, and he talks about the star, and he talks about the death march, and he talks about the beatings, and he writes these things that in a general sense. So we learn those things. We, like you and me, learn these things. And some of it is, most of it is horrible, but some of it is ironic, some of it is bizarre, and I kind of comment whenever I feel like it about how nutty it is, or horrifying it is, or so it's the journey to them. I went to Germany to look for them, and I found them. I absolutely found them, and they found me.
So I want to build on that just a little bit more. Right? You wrote in the middle, right, when you first got to Germany, that you didn't even know what you didn't know. So what didn't you know, and were you able to find it?
Well, part of what I didn't know was, my father in America, he came to America in 1950, married my mother 20 years younger than him in 51 or something, divorced. I was born a couple of years later. They separated a couple of years after that. But my father struck me. He worked in a sweatshop his whole life until he had a bunch of strokes, and then it was my job to deal with him, and I put him in a nursing home, and that was his life in America. He worked like a horse. He had no wife. His daughter, who was his everything, he saw just once a week. And if I'll tell you that I looked forward, what time is it? Is it time to go? Is it time for me to go home? And I thought my father was a loser. I thought I was the daughter of losers. But I wasn't. I learned that. I learned that my father in Europe was a substantial, these letters indicate that he was poetic. You know, he writes in one of the letters, if I had wings, I would fly to you. And I think, who wrote that? I didn't know that guy. I didn't know the guy that wrote that. I would fly to you if I had wings, and other sarcastic things as well, because, so I learned that. I learned about my father's first wife. He had a wife that was, and a daughter that I didn't know about really. He had a son that I did know about. I learned when I was 14 that my father had a son who, the year I was born, who was sent on Kindertransport in 19, you know, I was never a person who could rattle off dates and facts. It was like, but I can now, you know, so I learned that. I learned dates, I learned facts, I learned where my father's first wife and daughter were killed. I learned when they were killed. I learned who the commander, the commando got, the leader of that particular horror, who he was. He has a Wikipedia page. A lot of these people, so that's funny, right? To me, that's funny that the guy who was responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people has a Wikipedia page. I'm just saying, I might be a little bizarre, but, and it's not funny, it's just in the ironic, you know, I tried to have a Wikipedia page and they vetted me for weeks before I could get my own page, but okay. I guess, I mean, I learned so many things. Do you want more? I mean,
no, I think that's good. That's the book, basically.
That is the book.
That's the book. Now that the story is out and the book exists, when somebody in the audience tonight goes and buys the book and takes it home and reads it over Shabbat, what's the takeaway message? What story are you trying to tell them about their own lives?
First of all, I would say about your parents, perhaps. I would say that how well do we know our parents? Our parents they had a life before us. And so I would say, and you as parents, I would say to remind your children that they might want to learn who you are and who you were before they met you, so that they'll actually know a little bit more about themselves when push comes to shove, why they behave a particular way that may seem odd, but funny, you behaved that way too when you were 20. So that, and you know, this takeaway about the survivor-fighter thing, for me, is kind of big. Because I do feel like the term survivor diminished those people. They did more than survive.
So really, survivor versus fighter, it just depends on the translation.
And the interpretation. Indeed, one is diminishing. You know, and I don't mean that as you know, if you want to call it survivor, be my guest. But for me, being the daughter of a Holocaust survivor did not empower me.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.